United we stand, divided we fall is the last phrase of the famous Pink Floyd song called Hey You. We find the track, of course, on this iconic album called The Wall. And a wall is most probably the ultimate symbol of division. In this episode, we have a look at books that talk about what empathy is and how it can help to unite us and tear down walls that might live in our heads. And one of these books in this episode could even help us to practically further develop our empathetic skills. But first, we start with a little psychology test on the matter. And for your convenience, you can find chapters in the notes section underneath this episode. So you can, if you want, jump right away to the books that you are interested in. Welcome back to Bold Books and Bones. The Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, who is in the little world of psychologists world famous, developed a simple test to see if young children are able to take the perspectives of others. And that would be an indication of their mental or cognitive development. The test that the psychologist Jean Piaget developed is called the 3 mountains task. There are different versions of the test, but for the purpose of this episode, I keep it very simple. If you have young children running in your home, you could even do the test yourself if you like. I always found that using my own son as a guinea pig for my psychological experiments was a good idea. Unfortunately, he is now much too old to get him to do the experiments. Anyhow, for this experiment, you need a child between 3 and 10 years of age. You put your child in front of a little model of 3 mountains, like this one that I created for this episode. Of course, you can use some Lego or other toys to create your own version. Now, initially the child sees the whole setup from the same perspective as you see it now, so from your perspective. Then you ask the girl or boy to look at the setup from all its sides. Best is to let the child explore it by walking around the 3 mountains. While doing that, your child will most probably notice that on each mountaintop there are different items. In this case, there are 3 flags with different colors and a little man standing here. Next, you bring your child back to the initial position. Now you show him or her pictures or drawings that show this scene from different angles. You could, for example, use your smartphone to make these pictures. The first question you ask to your child while he stands in the same place where he started: which picture shows the view that you see now? Now, children around the age of 4 in general have no problem to find the right picture. The second question you ask is then, what do I see from my point of view? And again, while staying where he or she is, so looking at the scene from his or her perspective, the child can choose from the different pictures in front of him or her. Now, for the second question, children of around the age of 4 in general would choose the wrong picture, because they would often choose the picture that best reflect once again their own point of view. This is of course very normal, and it is called the egocentric view. As they then grow older, they become more aware that other perspectives exist. Children of about 7 or 8 years of age will normally more consistently select the correct picture. What happens is that the egocentric view is then not the only possible option anymore. The young child has then developed the important cognitive skill of what we call perspective taking. That our human brain is wired to take the perspectives of others at such a young age is of course critical, because we are social creatures. If we are not able to take another people's perspective, we might do a lot of harm to others, and we could hardly come to a consensus when we are debating or when we try to solve complex problems in a community. I was wondering if there would be an adult version of such a test in the digital age, would we then pass the test? Because we see, unfortunately, a lot of division in many communities at the moment. We could ask ourselves if we have created metaphorical walls in our heads that block out information from people who we perceive as different or that hold different beliefs. Do we only seek information from news outlets that confirm what we already know and believe, or are most of us still perfectly capable of truly listening to others? Whatever the situation is in your community, I like to present 3 books that might help to further develop or improve your and my empathy. The first book that I came across is this amazing book called War of the Worldviews. This book came about because one of the authors, whose name is Deepak Chopra, and who is very much focused on the spiritual part of life, gave a lecture. And in the audience of that particular lecture was Leonard Mlodinov, who is a physicist and who knows a lot about quantum physics. Both men have a totally different worldview and don't really agree on much when it comes to important questions about life and the universe. Now, instead of trying to shout the other down or insult the other or try to ridicule the ideas of the other, something we can unfortunately see a lot these days on social media and even by some major news outlets. However, they did something remarkable. They decided to write a book together. The structure of the book is very clever. Each chapter starts with a question, and one of the authors would write his answer about this question. For example, the first question is, how did the universe emerge? In the case of this question, Leonard, who represents the scientific perspective, would answer first. And next, Deepak would react to Leonard's point of view from a spiritual perspective. So it is not 2 people who are talking next to each other. Instead, it are 2 people who have the courage and do the work to listen to what the other has to say, and then formulate their thoughts and insights and put them on paper. I feel that I can benefit from such kind of books. Instead of clever one-liners and data that are made up just to fit the argument, we see in this book an example of how a debate really should be, so that we, the observers of the debate, can learn from it and come to our own conclusions. If you favor the spiritual perspective on life, or you favor the scientific perspective, or you are open to both perspectives, the way these 2 men argue demands reflection from the reader. It forces us to look over the wall that we might have in our heads. So this book is a perfect exercise in perspective taking. Now, I like to think that to truly listen is one of the preconditions for empathy. Therefore, the second book I like to share is called Listen Like You Mean It. I was positively surprised when I read it, because too often when I read about this subject, I find that or there is a too general take on the subject, or I read things about listening that are so basic that in both cases it does not really help me to practically improve this important skill. This book is different because it is a practical guide with lots of hands-on advice. It is written by Siamena Verguccia, I hope I pronounced this right, and she has worked for LinkedIn, Pinterest and Twitter, And more specifically, she has done a lot of user research. So she has done hundreds of conversations about how people use products and what they really think about them. And she also gives examples from her personal life. I found that Xiaomena's book brings a refreshing angle on the topic of listening. While doing her user research, she had to connect with total strangers, and she often had conversations with them about sensitive and private topics. For her, it is not about getting the right information as quickly as possible, but about connecting with people and via this way receiving the information that is needed to improve the user experience of a product. Throughout the book, you feel that she has a ton of practical knowledge on the matter, and she not only shares techniques and scripts that might help to improve our listening skill, but she also includes checklists to help us reflect on ourselves when it comes to listening. I especially like part 3 of the book that is called Rest and Recharge. This chapter zooms in on how empathetic listening can give a feeling of deep satisfaction, but also it talks about how energy draining it can be to be a professional listener. I like how she makes the reader aware that listening with empathy is important, but how speaking up with empathy is important too. She shares with us how to honor our own limits, to avoid listeners' drain or even burnouts. I very much can relate to the principle that listening is a two-way activity. It is not just all about being there for others and take it all in all the time. The method that she describes will help to connect with people who have very different views. And her insights might prevent that unconsciously we start to build walls in our heads and become prisoners of our own opinions. So if you feel the need to further develop your skill of empathetic listening, then this book may be something for you. The third book is called Against Empathy. It has not only a provocative title, but it also has a well-researched content. The author shows us that maybe contrary to our intuition, that empathy is not always a force for good. Paul Bloom, the author, is not an evil man who wants to destroy what is good in people, but he is a psychologist and researcher who looks at empathy in a critical way, and he helps us, the readers, to get a deeper and more nuanced understanding of this concept and of its consequences. One aspect that he makes us aware of is that empathy has often a narrow focus, and he points out that this is one of its weaknesses. He compares this narrow focus with a spotlight, and according to him, when we are empathetic, we put our spotlight on one part of a complex situation and leave the rest in darkness. He illustrates this by citing an experiment by the social psychologist Daniel Bateson. Subjects in one of his experiments were asked to listen to an interview with a 10-year-old girl called Sherry Summers. In this experiment, the girl is said to be terminally ill, and she would love to get access to a special foundation called the Quality Life Foundation. This foundation could help her cope with her difficult and fatal situation. The participants of the experiments are split into two groups. One group was asked to listen in an objective and rather detached way. The second group was asked to listen with empathy, and therefore they were asked to try to feel the full impact of what this child has been experiencing so far, given her fatal condition. In the next step of the experiment, all the participants were asked if the girl should move up on the waiting list for the support from the foundation. The experiment shows that 3/4 of the subjects in the second condition, so the empathetic condition, wanted to move her up on the waiting list. In comparison, only 1/3 of the participants in the first condition would move her up the waiting list. Meaning that in this experiment, being empathetic meant that people put their spotlight on the girl, despite the negative effect for the other children on the list who would have to wait longer once Sherry Summers was moved up. This laboratory experiment also showcases what is called in psychology the identifiable victim effect. This effect describes that we feel a greater empathy and we are more likely to help when a tragedy is about a specific and identifiable person. If the victims of a tragedy are a large, vague group of people, for example, the victims of an earthquake in another country, then chances are that our empathy is much lower and we are much less motivated to help. These and many other examples that Paul Bloom shares helps to create a more nuanced idea of what empathy is. And it takes you away from the position that empathy is by default good and thus always create good results. This book shows the richness of the concept and helps us to look at empathy from many different angles. One of the things that this book also does is making us aware of a potential empathy trap. It does not say that we should not help others or give to charities, but that we could give intelligently and with an eye to the consequences. In this sense, the author Paul Bloom is absolutely in favor of doing good and helping others. However, he rather promotes compassion instead of empathy. According to him, compassion is feeling for and not feeling with the other. In this way, he argues, we can approach a complex situation in a more rational way and make better decisions in how to deal with that particular situation. The author further explores many interesting questions, like, is empathy the foundation of morality? What about empathy and intimacy, or empathy and doing good? He even looks at empathy and politics and at how empathy relates to violence and cruelty. So I would say that the author brings a more analytical look at the concept of empathy, and the examples and research that he presents is often surprising and eye-opening. The book made me think about my assumptions on what empathy is. And no, after reading this book, I'm not at all against empathy now. However, I learned that in some situations in my personal and professional life, it might be better to show more rational compassion instead. I hope you liked this episode, and if you do, please leave a comment or share it with someone that might be interested. In the meanwhile, please stay curious, stay free, and see you at the next episode of Bold Books and Bones. Bye.